Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work and how to work. If you're new, I'm Roy, and together with Min, we are startup investors in the future of work. This is our 127th day and question, and we love having guests. And today we've got Ray Shan, who's at the Long-Term Stock Exchange, one of our favorite platforms to watch evolve. And we are talking about productivity.
Totally. And Ray, well, before he was at the Long-Term Stock Exchange, which he can tell us a little bit more about, he's had a variety of experiences across product, software engineering, growth, including starting his own cotton apparel company, organic cotton apparel. And so we wanted to invite him to talk about this week how to get things done. And so the question that I have for you, Ray, is like, how do I know if I should keep working on something or pivoting? And it sounds like you've made a number of different pivots over your career. And so what do you think?
Yeah, certainly. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor, and I've enjoyed your show a lot, watched a lot of episodes.
Awesome.
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and honestly, a really hard question to get right. LTSC is my fourth startup, and frankly, I still have a hard time with it, and certainly made a number of mistakes. But I do think it's an important question to get right, because I think deciding when to pivot and how to pivot fast is what separates productive teams from teams that are not as productive. So I can give you a bad I can give you a bad example of what not to do. So at my last startup, we were building a search engine for schools. So it's a little bit like a Google Scholar competitor, right? The core technology was a knowledge graph back behind the scenes generated by AI. And the idea is that we'll generate more relevant search results for our users, right? But then at the same time, we were like, well, we wanted to be a little bit different than Google Scholar. We don't want to just show a bunch of blue links. So we actually spent 6 months building a really fancy 3D UI with a graph that literally represents the knowledge graph behind the scenes. It was a ton of work. And at some point after you work on it for a while, the sunk cost fallacy kind of set in. You're like, oh shit, I did a bunch of work. I don't want to,
Yes, it might not have been worth it.
Yeah. Oh, and on top of that, it took us 2 months to prepare for a trade show, because we were selling to universities. So, it was one of these school trade shows. And you would think that, after all that work and after going to the trade show, meeting all the buyers and, the hockey stick would just commence, right? Like the users are just going to take off. But, like all other startups, that did not happen the first try. And what we actually learned was that the users didn't care about the fancy UI. They actually prefer the blue links. Google actually did something right, because the blue links are simple. And what they really cared about was how relevant the search results are. So we actually could have just tested the data and the search results without spending all 6 months building the UI. So I think that's an example what not to do. And I got some learnings from that about how we can do better and how we can pivot faster.
So you're saying that it's less about about the judgment of whether to pivot or not, as it is the speed of iteration. I love that. But then, consequences, one of the things that we often see with startups is, and I think it's just true generally in work life, is if you're faced with a choice that seems monumental, figuring out how to get out of needing to make that choice is often the best way to do it. Instead of weighing, big things on the scales of justice, it's like, well, no, if we only iterated 5 times faster, then this would be a lower stakes decision and we wouldn't sweat it as much. So I love that insight.
Sorry, that's right. Absolutely.
I was going to say, if you had to make that choice again, is there something you would have done differently?
Yeah. I would say two things that come to mind. One is really knowing what the vision of the company is. Like, what is it that we're here to do? So to backtrack a little bit, what is a pivot, right? At LTSC, we define a pivot as a change in strategy without a change in vision. So the prerequisite of that is that you have to know what your vision is, right? And an example comes to mind. So if you think about Instagram, right? So Instagram is one of probably the most famous pivot examples ever. And actually started out as Bourbon, which is a location-based sharing company, kind of like Foursquare, right? And it didn't really take off. But Bourbon was created to essentially help their users to share their daily lives, right? So they did a pivot which is a change in strategy without a change in their vision. So Instagram is still an app that helps people to share their daily lives. But they took the nugget from Bourbon that's the most important, like the picture that people attach to all the status updates, right? That's what people really wanted to see and cared about and wanted to be creative with. So they completely changed the strategy. It's a different app, different name, different brand, different everything, but the vision didn't change. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is like, you really have to know what your vision is and what you are here to do for your users. If you know that well, then it's easy to change your strategy and tactics. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think, just before we run out of time, would be great to hear about is as people have watched the long-term stock exchange evolve, applying that pivot and lean and fast iteration philosophy, the kind of scientific method for startups, to something that seems like it has to really get it right, because you're dealing with, really consequential choices about the companies that choose to list, has been something that I think people are just like, hey, how would that work in something like a long-term stock exchange? It would just be great to hear a little dot on how does it work in that context.
Absolutely. So certainly an exchange is very difficult to build. And the last time it was built before LTSE, it was like 80 years ago or something, right? The way that we think about this is that we try to break a bigger problem down into smaller problems. We always start with a hypothesis, right? So the hypothesis of the long-term stock exchange is that we can build a better environment for companies to be public in. But what does that mean? There are a couple components of it. One is that the better environment means that we want the companies to do something right for the long term and for them to get credit for it in the public market. So that comes in the form of listing standards. As a stock exchange, our superpower is that we can regulate, we can essentially hold the companies accountable to our listing standards. So we ask them to do certain things that are good for investors, good for stakeholders, and MVP we built for that is like listing standards are essentially a set of rules, right? And we can iterate very quickly by essentially writing them down on paper, going to all the stakeholders, testing them out, and the stakeholders being founders, investors, regulators, and whatnot, right? So we can iterate very quickly on that front. And that sort of separates that hypothesis and that MVP from building the exchange itself. Now, building the exchange, like you said, certainly a very complicated thing. There's a giant, thick book of rules that we have to meet, right? We think of that less as an experiment and more as a service deliverable. There are certain things that you have to do as a business, like meeting your regulator demands or answering your customers' phone calls. Those we kind of sort of put in a separate bucket. So I think these kind of apply to more mature businesses. Is you continue to experiment with new ideas, but at the same time, you're delivering guaranteed services for your stakeholders.
Awesome.
Oh, that's great. Wow. So if anybody wants to learn more about the Long-Term Stock Exchange, you can find Ray and LTSE on Twitter or anywhere else. Thanks so much, Roy, for joining us today. We're so thrilled to have you. And we'll be back tomorrow about more how to get things done questions. And so if you have any, leave them down below in the comments, and we'll be back tomorrow.
Yeah, to be continued. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you.